Hello and welcome to another episode of a Trip of a Lifetime podcast with me, Celeste, and I am joined once again by Helena.
Hello.
Today we're reviewing The Idiot's Lantern, which is episode 8/7, depending on whether you include the Christmas invasion or not, of series two. It was released, well, or I should say, it aired on the 27th of May 2006. It's directed by Euros Lyn and written by Mark Gatiss. And once again, Mark Gatiss leading us straight in with the horror. The uh, opening scene of this is, your stereotypical horror opening. It's a dark and stormy night. There's a man, he's on his own, and something weird happens. The alien, the wire, um, is zapped in via lightning and goes into his television set in his television shop, and the story proceeds from there. I do find it interesting how, I mean, it's explained in the episode, but his face gets taken and yet it also doesn't.
Yeah, it's like she sort of half saps him of his energy.
Yeah, just enough to leave him as a kind of husk of himself to kind of do what she asks.
Mm.
Because apparently, originally in the original script, Mr. Magpie was supposed to be a lot more malevolent. But Russell changed it because he didn't think it suited the tone of the story, and he thought he didn't think the story should be too dark, which in a way I think is a bit of a shame because I think the episode,
Creepy setup.
yeah, there's a lot of good about this episode. There's a lot of kind of um themes about generational gaps, and
Mhm.
how as some adults get older, they get more and more conservative in their views, and things about like gender roles and toxic masculinity and things like that. And also apparently in the original script Tommy was gay and had a crush on the Doctor. Which,
Robbed us.
yeah, while that's not necessarily, I mean, I don't think Tommy had a crush on the Doctor in this finished episode, but I certainly think some of the gay subtext is still in there.
Yeah,
You've got the thing about how what's his name, Mr. Connolly was talking about his son to, I think it was Auntie Betty, and how he's talking about how he was a bit of a mummy's boy and that he should beat it out of him, in the
yeah,
kind of implied, oh, if you're too girly, you're gay kind of thing. That And then also when they're right at the end, well, not right at the end, it's kind of start the third act where the doctor's where Mr. Connolly's just been kicked out by his wife, and the Doctor and Tommy are about to go off to Magpie's shop with the detective, uh and how Tommy's given this massive speech about how you fought against fascism, and so we could all think what we want to think and love who we want to love. And I was like, that's gay.
Mhm.
It's a little bit gay there.
Yeah.
Um, so there were definitely little hints left in, but nothing too explicit.
I
Um,
think it maybe it would have definitely been another interesting layer to like the characters and like especially the character dynamics, but
mm,
I think it maybe would have been a bit too much all for one episode.
yeah,
Would have maybe not been handled in the best way had that been like the direction that they decided to go with it because
mm,
it's like a lot to cram into 45 minutes.
yeah. But in terms of the themes, I think the episode did pretty well.
Yeah.
It's subtle, but it doesn't feel like it's hollow in its message. It feels sincere. So I think it's after the cold open, we get introduced to the Connolly family for the first time. You've got obviously Mr. and Mrs. Connolly, you've got Mrs. Connolly's mother, the grandmother,
Hmm.
and you've got Tommy. We get the impression. I mean, it's interesting how in the first scene they seem like a relatively harmonious family, at least to start off with. I mean, yes, Mr. Connolly's going off to the pub, but that's
Yeah,
not unusual in those days. It was pretty usual for one or both parents to go off to the pub and often leave their kids on their own or in the car. Like, that was not unusual. Um, and it seems like they get along relatively well, and Tommy's obviously begging for a TV. Kind of it reminds me of how when I was younger I used to beg for like a DS or something,
yeah.
with I guess the TV back in the oh god, when was this? It must what late 40s this must be,
I think
early
it's
50s.
it's 1953 because
Oh
it's
right,
the
yes, yes. Didn't I stupidly didn't write the date down? I should have done. Um, so back in the 50s when TVs were relatively new, Rose comments on it herself that apparently her grandmother, who I don't think we ever met in this
no.
in the show at all, she must have passed away off screen prior to series one, but how um TVs were rare, and she's looking down the street and all of the houses have got aerial, almost all of them have got TV aerials. So straight away it's sending, so I mean obviously we know that the problem is the TV. We know
Yeah,
that from the first scene, but it's setting off. I mean it's a comment that the doctor actually comes back to right at the end of the episode. It's not foreshadowing for us, it's foreshadowing for him in a way. And so, I mean, then Mr. Conley to Tommy says, "Oh well, I'll think about it for coronation." It seems quite like harmonious to start off with, and then the next time we see the family is a little bit later on. Um, Suddenly, I mean, obviously, my first instinct when looking at the scene, because both Tommy and Mrs. Connolly are sitting absolutely rigid, solemn, in place, and whereas he's very angry. He's being shot at a from a low angle, whereas they're being shot from a high angle, so he looks a lot bigger and a lot more dominant. Also, apparently, because I had a quick look at the trivia on IMDb, that most of this episode is shot on a Dutch angle the entire time, which I didn't actually realize whilst watching it. But in that scene, it's very obvious because he is at a very clear angle that
yeah,
and so my first thought was he's just hit one of them. That was my first thought of he's clearly quite emotionally abusive, even if he isn't necessarily physically abusive. I mean, we never see any indication of the latter, but certainly emotionally, yes. Um uh, and then you hear the tapping at the top on the floor upstairs, and then you realize, oh, the reason why they're so uptight is actually the grandmother. Although him being emotionally abusive probably isn't helping the situation.
yeah,
Um, because I'd forgotten that we don't actually see the granny's face being taken, and that for a while what the actual problem is kind of left in the dark, because even though in the cold open we see Mr. Magpie's face kind of on the thing, we don't see the result of it, and obviously when we meet him again he's fine, or seemingly fine. So I guess it was kind of a bit of a, what's going on, what's the problem kind of
yeah.
thing.
I think definitely adds a lot more to the tension. Like, I
Mm.
think you definitely feel it a lot between like the Connolly family, but especially kind of it feels like it's not necessarily a family argument. It kind of feels like an argument between them and something else, but they're just not sure what it is. Like they know
Yeah.
something's wrong with grandma, but like they don't know what to do about it. They don't know what it is. They don't know how it happens. And it feels really not like desperate, but like they kind of feel helpless. And I
Mm.
think that definitely comes across in the way, like, obviously the dad is treating the rest of the family because, like, he doesn't know what else to do. So he immediately goes into kind of attack mode, which, like, considering obviously freshly out of the war, like, it's been a few years, but like,
Mm.
kind of still very in memory, like the doctor says. Like, it's post war, everyone's come off rations and it's like the coronation. So it should be kind of this celebration of like
Yeah.
national pride, like everyone feeling very patriotic, but like there's something very sinister kind of within the family unit, and it's kind of just builds and kind of comes out in this like instead of comforting his family, he's kind of almost blaming them. He's like,
Yeah.
it's like kind of your fault for acknowledging it. Like it's he's very British, like stiff upper lip, like we don't talk about that. Whereas obviously Mrs. Connolly is very concerned, like she's literally she's openly like crying for most of the episode because it's so
Mm.
traumatic, which like is completely understandable as well.
Because
But
I mean, presumably he fought in. I mean, I'm not sure if he would have fought in World 1 or World War 2, because I think he would have been old enough probably to have fought in both.
yeah,
Um, so there would definitely have been an element of, I've seen all of these horrible things, I'm gonna bottle all of it up, and because obviously therapy wasn't really a thing, they
yeah,
didn't really. I mean, psychology and stuff was being practiced, but even to this day, it's very stigmatized.
yeah,
Therapists are often looked down on and seen as a lesser type of doctor because they're not doing anything visible to help people, if that makes sense. Like,
yeah,
you can't see someone cure mental trauma. So I wonder if a lot of that trauma is manifesting as anger because he doesn't really know what to do with all these emotions.
yeah.
Um, Obviously that's not excusing that character's behavior. Um, but
You definitely get a sense of why he is the way he is. Like,
yeah,
I, as soon as uh, obviously the Doctor and Rose meet them, they knock on the door, and he immediately knows exactly like what this guy is. He's like he stereotypes him, and like he's right. He's like, what post-war you fought in? Like he's like you fought in the war. Union Jacks are up everywhere, or Union flags are
yeah,
everywhere. So obviously I work for the Queen. And like
yeah,
he gets it right, like straight off the bat. He's like, well, of course, come in. It's like it's kind of a very stereotypical view of the decade, but it's almost like it's a stereotype because it was true of like so many families.
yeah. Because they'd been through those two wars, and it was the propaganda was
Yeah.
everywhere. It's all pro Britain, pro Britain, pro Britain. That people, even somewhat to this day, don't always question it. Like we trust the government, we trust the police, blah blah blah. But equally, this episode, I think, subtly maybe not the monarchy. I think that this episode is pretty pro monarchy, but
Yeah.
in terms of police, there is a bit of light criticism. There's a bit of light criticism of the government as well, in terms of, because it's the coronation, they're not doing anything about it. They're just kind of shoving all these people in a jail cell and hoping the problem goes away.
Um, it's like what the doctor says as well. Like I think he literally mentions like I thought this was meant to be like Britain, not like it's like the Gestapo. Like they're
Yeah,
literally bundling people up, shoving them in cars, and it's like this is not what it's meant to be on the day of the coronation. Like it's not right. But I think it's like obviously the BBC in like the mid 2000s, they're obviously not going to openly say like, and this is what's bad about the monarchy and also the government and also the police. Like that's not
yeah,
something that they do even today. Like they're still
yeah,
very very careful about what they say around the subject. But I think this is kind of like very, I think typically of Mark Gatiss as well, like he's very like careful around these kind of subjects with like he kind of knows how to put it across without openly being like kind of he doesn't openly say what he wants to say, but like it's kind of if you read into it, you can kind of pick up on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get that, but then there's also times where, like, because he did. I mean, this is a while in the future. I'm not sure when this episode will get covered, but Victory of the Daleks, he wrote that episode, and yet I mean, arguably because Moffat would have rewritten parts of the episode. So I don't know whether it's Gatiss or Moffat, but at least one of them glorified Churchill a lot when we know he's a racist war criminal. But yeah.
It
Anyway,
to
so
me it feels a lot more Moffat than it does.
yeah, that's true. Um, Especially because Moffat then brings him back later on as well. So anyway, so let's talk about the Doctor and Rose and their introduction in this episode because this is another clear example of the Doctor and Rose planning to go somewhere and then ending up
Yeah.
somewhere completely different because they're planning to go to America in the 50s to see Elvis. Um, and obviously that's not where they ended up because TARDIS was like, nope, you're going here because this is where the problem is.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like they wanted to go late 50s New York and they ended up in early 50s North London.
yeah.
Like basically identical, really.
So, they're on the scooter, which by the end of the episode actually gets given to Tommy, which I didn't pick up on before. Um, you've got Rose somehow having a helmet that matches her skirt perfectly. Like, I just wonder if the Doctor's just got a whole array of different colored helmets in the TARDIS somewhere.
Costume, to be fair. It feels very like, infinite TARDIS wardrobe. It's got to
Yeah.
be something for everyone in there.
Then they show up at the colonies. No, Connolly's. God, I can't speak today. They end up at the Connolly's house. And then I just love the scene where they're in there and they're both criticizing Mr. Connolly
Oh,
for
it's
his
out outstanding.
yeah,
The
because
no, yeah, sorry.
no, yeah, so because they're just tearing his kind of gender rules to shreds but also manipulating him at the same time because he's not the brightest guy, let's
No.
just say. Like his son is a lot cleverer than he is, but also I think not only do they obviously give Tommy somewhat of the confidence to stand up for himself, but they also give Mrs. I can't speak, I can't say it. They also give Mrs. Connolly
Yeah,
the guts to because at the start of the episode she's very meek, she's very shy, very hesitant to stand up to her husband.
yeah.
um Whereas at the end she's literally telling him to pack his things and leave, because I guess this was the era where, I mean, divorce was still very stigmatized, but it's
Yeah.
from the 50s where people started to properly recognize that staying in a marriage that isn't happy and isn't healthy isn't a good thing to do for anyone.
But I think in the 50s it tended to be like you had to have a very good reason for
Mm,
divorce. Like they wouldn't like it's not like now where you could just say like, oh, like we don't want to be married anymore because like and the courts are like that's fair enough. Like go separate ways. In the 50s it was like you had to have very specific reason. You had to have evidence of it.
mm.
So
Or you
I
had
think
to be like a famous person or something.
yeah. Um I think her kicking him out is like obviously doesn't necessarily like lead to divorce, but I think it's a
Yeah.
very bold step on her behalf, especially like it's not exactly a private like I'd like you to leave. It's like get out. Like
Yeah,
it's
and
not
Yeah,
Like,
and there was like a street party going on at the same time. So like it's not as if no one would have witnessed it.
it's
So
public.
yeah, I agree that maybe they wouldn't necessarily have gotten divorced, but they were certainly separated, which is still at
Yeah,
least a right step in the right direction. But also I do think it's still setting up the idea that, this was a divorce was a thing that started to happen from about this era,
yeah,
along with, men not having to constantly be all brash and
yeah.
violent and
Kind of the balancing out of gender roles because, like, obviously, 50s,
yeah.
60s was like very much like the women who still had jobs after the war. Like, a lot of them would be kicked out when some men came back, and like they then had to find their own jobs. A lot of single mothers like that had lost their husbands, so now had to support like the entire family.
Mm,
And I think it's like obviously this it kind of shows how even the families that didn't lose anyone still lost quite a lot. Like the
yeah.
war kind of took something from everyone. And I
Mm,
think they do that, they handle it really delicately because it kind of shows the impact that obviously fighting in the war had on the men at the time, but also kind of what they brought home and the way it kind of festered in like the family relationships.
yeah, because also like corporal punishment in terms of like children, like beating your children,
Yeah,
wasn't unusual. It's still, I mean, it happened in schools up until about the 70s. Like, I mean, my parents, I mean, neither of them got hit, but my mum talked about how, some places in some schools they still use the cane when she went to primary school. My
yeah,
dad, there were teachers that would throw like a board rubber or some
yeah.
chalk at the
When the children,
students.
yeah,
So like certainly in the 50s, I mean, there's literally, as I mentioned earlier, Auntie Betty saying, "Oh, you should beat it out of him." That was a normal thing at the time. So it's kind of with this, Tommy's generation, who I guess would be our grandparents' generation.
yeah, boomers, I think. Well,
Yeah,
no, the not
yeah,
quite.
boomers, baby boomers. Yeah, because well, I guess he'd be a bit older, but a little bit
Yeah,
older than
because
baby
these are
boomers.
the silent generation, I think.
Yeah, I guess he'd be right at the end of the silent generation, but
Yeah,
certainly it would impact the baby boomers in a similar way. Of this was the first generation that could kind of get more in touch with their feelings and start to recognize that actually maybe these things that we've been doing for generations isn't good.
yeah,
And it's kind of, I mean, it's focusing on generational trauma, I guess.
yeah. And I think kind of setting that to the backdrop of the coronation,
Mm,
I think was very clever because obviously, like the events leading up to Queen Elizabeth's coronation were very tricky themselves.
mm,
Kind of, obviously, she wasn't even in line to be like on the throne until her uncle abdicated, and then suddenly
yeah,
her dad was king, and then suddenly he passed away, and then
yeah,
she was suddenly put on the throne of
and
a post-war Britain.
yeah, and she was only in her 20s at the
Yeah,
time.
I think
I
she
think
was
that's what
23
I
or
was
20.
thinking. 25. Okay.
I was close.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, 23. Yeah, so 25. That is a young age, especially with that amount of pressure. I mean, I know the monarchy is mostly a figurehead, but she's still gonna have to do a lot of diplomatic
Yeah,
um
like it wasn't what
stuff.
it is now.
No.
Because obviously it's kind of just they're just there now. But in the 50s, they were, especially obviously with King George like leading them through the war, like it was everyone looked to the monarchy for hope, kind of to
Yeah.
lead properly. And like there was a
Well,
very
most
strong
people.
well, yeah.
Because there still were people, there's always been people that have opposed the monarchy.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays, because obviously we've just had the coronation this year, And I think most people are feeling a very different way towards this one than
Yeah.
we would have been with Queen Elizabeth's. Um,
And I think like partially that's obviously the scenarios surrounding them are like very different.
yeah,
Like obviously or like all the stuff with like Prince Andrew, but also coming out of COVID and like
mm,
kind of with everyone sort of losing trust in the government, everyone like what most people automatically connect government monarchy in their heads. So it's not and like obviously with the Queen was like on the throne for so long, it kind of felt like, well, that's it.
yeah, it would never
Where
end.
yeah, whereas
Yeah,
obviously when she took the throne, they went through like monarchs in quite quick succession, and then
yeah,
she was there, and it was kind of post-war. Like she feels like she's here to stay, and she was, to be fair, like for a
yeah.
very, very long
I mean,
time.
over seven, oh, seven, almost just over 70 years. I mean, she got to,
Yeah, I think it was 71.
yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if she quite reached 71.
It was like very
It was
close.
like 70 and a half years or something
Yeah.
like that.
But I mean, we still face a lot of the issues that like this episode covers, like
Yeah,
um generational trauma, like emotional, physical abuse in households, like
yeah,
domestic and also like child abuse. Like although it's like it's sort of skimmed over in the episode, but like you still feel the presence of it very much there.
yeah. Um, I mean, there's been a lot of narratives about generational trauma quite recently. I mean, we've had Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I still haven't watched yet. I really need
Yeah,
to.
it's
Um, as well
standing.
as yeah, as well as Turning Red and
Hmm.
Canto. Like, there's been a lot of stories about that because I think people are sudden because the amount of people going to therapy nowadays and
Yeah,
kind of also on the internet being able to like read up on things and realize, hold on a minute, that's not normal.
yeah.
Um,
Like
yeah,
sorry.
no, it's just I think people are suddenly realizing, oh, this wasn't normal or this wasn't okay, and starting to
Yeah,
unlearn behaviors. There was
but
also
yeah.
a lot of
I was gonna say
sorry,
on Doctor Who, the number one way to work through family troubles is to face a life or death situation together, it seems to be.
yeah. Um, there's a lot of archive footage that was, or I say a lot, there was a bit of archive footage that was used in this. There was a bit of a clip from Muffin the Mule, which was a popular kids' TV show. I believe they did like a rebooted animated version when we were really small. Because I vaguely remembered CBeebies showing
Yeah.
something um to do with it. And then obviously you've got the actual footage of the coronation as well. Presumably the BBC footage because you know
Obviously.
they'd be able to get it quite easily. I guess it helps that the BBC was one of the few channels that actually existed. Well, it was one of the two channels that
Yeah.
existed back in the 50s because you had that one, BBC One, you had ITV One, and that was it. Um, or the channels that would become
Yeah.
BBC One and ITV because it was just the BBC and ITV at that point. Also the title for the episode is apparently a slang term for television. I have never heard anyone use this phrase ever, but I know it is an idiom that exists.
Yeah. I've heard my
Um,
nan use it, and
mm,
that's kind of it. But like
yeah,
it's that generation, so
yeah. I mean, presumably the idiot in this episode is Mr. Connolly, the titular idiot, because I know obviously like the idiot's lantern it's supposed to refer to anyone who has a TB, but
mm.
like I think in this episode, if anyone's the idiot here, it's Mr. Connolly.
Yeah.
Especially since he was rallying against the idea of a TV, and then once he got it, he was like, "Oh, this is the best thing ever made," you know. And then there was also the grandmother. How before she obviously gets her face taken. In a way, I wonder if this phrase is actually what inspired the entire concept to begin with, and it's the fact that it rots your brain. It's one of those myths of how TV rots your brain or it turns your eyes square or all these other things um because it's a new thing and kids aren't going outside and all that, but
Yeah.
that kind of boomer conspiracy theory, if you like.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
I
think
think most people nowadays, if they say it, they mean it jokingly. But
yeah,
back then, it seemed to be like she seemed very serious that she thought this was an issue that might happen.
yeah,
And then, of course, it's foreshadowing that she then, I mean, she all of her brainwaves get feasted on. That is what the wire does. So it is a bit of foreshadowing.
yeah. I think as well by having the grandma like be the one that kind of gets impacted instead of like Tommy, I think it shows how it's not just kids that are
Mm,
like impacted that much by television. Like, because obviously Tommy says like she doesn't really go out much anyway. So it's like she's sat in there all day. Like, what else is she gonna do, kind of thing. Um, and I think it kind of helps to shift away the idea like it's literally only like children that are always glued to televisions because like it's anyone like and it's like you're
yeah.
very aware of that while you're sat there watching it and you're like, oh, are they making fun of me? I don't.
It's also like you wonder if some of this is because I mentioned earlier how Mr. Connolly um it's implied that he used to be a lot more liberal and then over the years has become a lot more conservative. But
Yeah,
you wonder how much of it is commenting on how older people are almost just as much, if not more, um um uh what's the word, at risk of being radicalized
yeah,
or and things like that are all falling for the conspiracy. I mean, you talk about, I mean, you hear about all the time like the Facebook conspiracy theories and like the
yeah.
anti-vax and all that
Like
stuff,
vaccines give you autism
which
and
is absolute rubbish.
yeah, but I think it kind of demonstrates how influential like just a tiny box of electric in your front room can be and
Yeah.
how much impact it can have on the whole family and like the relationships of the entire family.
Mm.
Um, which again is a very heavy topic.
Yeah.
Like maybe not as explicitly dark as the past episode, where obviously
No.
multiple people were murdered like very quickly, but like in this one, it's kind of a creeping sense of unwellness that kind of just sits in the corner of the room.
Well, I was looking again. I mentioned I was looking at the trivia on IMDb, and apparently this is the second story in New Who when no one dies.
Mm.
Wait, no, that's not even true because Mr. Magpie gets killed. So that's actually rubbish. Whoever put that on
How dare they?
IMDb, because
I
that, I
guess
mean,
like he dies, but he's not killed. I mean, like he's not directly murdered by the
no,
entity. It's kind of like,
but they said the first episode when no one dies specifically.
but also in what is it? The kid with the gas mask.
Yeah, that's the
I can't remember
first.
what
That's the
episode
first
called yet.
story.
But also, the doctor says like everybody lives as bombs are falling in the background, which is like such an ironic contrast because it's like, well, no, they don't, do they?
Yeah. Right, so we should probably move on to the actual plot of the episode because we haven't really said much about it yet.
Yeah.
Um, so we've got I mean, I don't think what the wire is ever actually explained.
No, it's just kind of an incorporeal alien of some kind.
Yeah, that clearly travels via electricity and is also seems to have been exiled from their race.
I think like because it says like it kind of escaped execution.
Mm,
So it might have been like it did have like a physical form and like could only escape that way, and that's why it wants a physical body because it kind of wants it
yeah.
back, kind of like the
Mm,
in the Unquiet Dead, um
yeah.
whichever those ones were called,
The Gelth.
those ones.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a similar thing.
Mm. Yeah, so I guess because they feed on electricity as well, is why that they're consuming people's brain waves, and somehow that sucks their facial features off as well. I'm not quite sure how that works.
Unfortunate side effects.
um, yeah, I think the CGI is certainly interesting because I think what they did is they put some sort of kind of like stocking like material over the people's faces, and then they kind of CGI'd over that to make it look like their face had gone completely, but it didn't feel completely. I mean, maybe it's just because we're talking now rather than at the time, because CGI has obviously developed quite a lot, but it doesn't feel that realistic.
Yeah, which is like I think an unfortunate side effect of most of the early Doctor Who's is like they kind of lose a bit of the like it kind of takes you out of the suspension of disbelief a little bit when you're like, hang on,
Yeah, I can see
that's
like
not
the vague shadow of their facial
yeah.
features. Yeah.
But like at the same time, it's kind of almost a bit more creepy because you can kind of see where their face used to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Which is
yeah,
like kind of obviously not intentional because like ideally it would like to be all gone, but
yeah.
kind of especially as a kid watching it like for the first time you're like, oh my god, what is that?
Mm.
Like, but yeah, I really did not like this one when I was a kid because it used to scare me so much. It was like the grandma tapping when you could
Mm.
hear her walking about. I was like, ugh.
Yeah. Apparently, again, IMDb trivia. Hopefully, this one's actually true this time. That apparently Magpie Electricals as a brand pops up in a lot of other episodes, and not just in the Russells era either. Apparently, it shows up in the Beast Below, so presumably on the Star Whale, but also in his. I mean, the most recent one that it cites on there is one of the monk episodes in series 10,
Hmm.
2017. So somehow the brand kept going. So presumably maybe he had like a, I don't know, a nephew or a niece or something to continue on his business.
Yeah, because like from the ending, you wouldn't really expect that the guy's business was going to be taking off anytime soon.
No, especially as he's never shown to have any kind of family either. So it's presumably it's not a child of his. Um,
Maybe like some distant like second cousin or something who like when he died, like they got it in his will or something like that.
yeah, maybe. Um,
Interesting though.
yeah. Speaking of other trivia that I spotted on there, apparently Nicholas Hoult wanted to audition for the character of Tommy, but was considered too young to play him. Um,
That would have definitely been an interesting role to look back on.
yeah, because I mean, he did start off as a child actor.
Yeah,
Um,
most famously in Skins.
yeah, which actually in the writer's tale, Russell actually watched, and so he's actually mentioned quite a few times in that. But obviously, it's interesting. I can't remember whether or not he mentioned that he was. he auditioned, and that's where that piece of trivia came from. Or not. It's been a while since I read it, but I think it's interesting in this episode the fact that Rose figures out what's going on a lot quicker than the Doctor.
Yeah, I think he's very off his game in this episode. I
Hmm.
mean, like he gets knocked out like if, almost immediately when
Yeah.
he's like, "Oh, I have some very good reasons." One, and then immediately gets like KO'd. Like is outstanding. It used to make me really laugh when I was a kid, and it still does, to be honest.
Yes,
And then
especially because, the Doctor's whole MO is to talk himself out of any situation, and faced with
yeah,
violence, no, not gonna work.
and yeah, I think Rose kind of hanging behind a little bit when she
Mm.
kind of she sees it and she's like, "That's not right." She's like, "I don't know my 50s TVs, but I know they're not meant to do that." And
Yeah, and then she goes on her own to Magpie's shop
yeah,
and obviously gets her face um
moved.
taken away. I don't know. Yeah, so I think the Doctor's reaction to Rose was really interesting as well. But I mean, I want to talk about the interrogation scene first, though, because I mean, he ends up in the interrogation room and he's talking with a detective, and it turns out that the detective's on the exact same page as he is. He just can't do anything about it because A, he's out of his depth, and B, he's been told by superiors to cover anything up because of the coronation.
Yeah,
And so it's interesting because I'd forgotten about that because I'd always thought for some reason that the detectives were always very reluctant to work with the Doctor, but actually he caves pretty quickly.
yeah,
Um, and then they bring Rose in, and obviously he gets very angry about her being just left in the street. But also, it's his direct reaction because I wrote it down because he says, like, because they ask if he knows her, and he says, "Know her, she's my," and then he cuts off. He stops
yeah.
himself from saying anything else because
Cave.
obviously they've not defined exactly what they are. Are they dating? Are they not? I don't think they ever really properly date because they don't ever actually label anything.
And it's like it kind of in the worst way possible foreshadows what happens like the last time that they see each other when it's like, well, I guess it's not the last time they see each other, but like when they say goodbye when she's stuck in the parallel universe and he's like, Rose Tyler, I cut
Yeah.
off. And it's like, I think very obviously probably not intentional in what they've done, but like it
Mm.
kind of gives you a sense of kind of his reluctancy to fully like not commit, but like admit almost his relationship with Rose in whatever capacity that may be.
Yeah, because it was a couple of episodes. I can't remember whether it was a school reunion or not, but Rose is like, "Oh, I want to stay with you forever," and he's like, "Well, you can spend the rest of your life with me, but I can't spend the rest of my life with you." And it's
Painful.
that that's stopping him because he knows it's going to end, and he doesn't know when, and he doesn't want to have to go through that pain having been an item. Because, like, if you look at any kind of doctor companion romance or any romance Doc's had with anyone, and the only one that's where he's explicitly labeled their relationship is River, and that's because he knew how they end before it even began.
Yeah,
So in a way, because the Doctor hates endings, he was at least prepared for how that ended. But with Rose, Clara, and Yaz, there's a lot of reluctance to to even start anything or even to acknowledge that there's anything going on. And if there
yeah.
is, in the case of Clara trying to push something, the Doctor's like, "I'm not your boyfriend, I'm not your partner, you
But
can't,
yeah,
we're not together," because the Doctor cannot cope with that loss.
yeah. I think that's kind of what makes me love the character of Martha so much
Mm,
because she knew obviously the doctor didn't feel the same way that she felt about him and she knew
yeah.
how it was going to end for her so it, like instead of waiting until she basically either he felt feelings back or she just died. She was like, I'm removing myself from this situation.
Yeah, which is the
I
smart thing
actually,
to do,
yeah,
frankly.
she's like the only one who was like, hang on, this might not end well for me. Like, my
Well,
family were kidnapped and tortured. Let me just take a step back. Um,
I mean, there were a few Chibnall companions that did that as well, but it was less impactful and more like, oh, I'm just going to leave. And you're like, oh, okay, sure.
it was kind of just like, I've run out of story for these characters. They're
Yeah.
no use to me anymore.
Yeah. I mean, there was a mention. I mean, to be fair, with Ryan, there was a bit of foreshadowing of him
Yeah,
maybe wanting to leave. But with the other, especially with Dan, it was a bit like,
he wasn't there for long enough for it to be anything.
but also it was so anticlimactic. It was like, oh, I almost died. Okay, I'm gonna leave now and not
Yeah,
appear in the rest of the episode. Like, oh, okay.
okay, I've got no house, like I've got no job, like I'm forever traumatized by what's happened to me. Let
Yeah,
me just go back and sit in a church now.
yeah. Also, Di won't talk to me because she's also traumatized, and
Yeah,
it's
like
like he got nothing out of that at all.
the poor man, he literally got nothing.
Uh, yeah. Anyway, so I also find it interesting how obviously the Doctor builds some sort of device. It's never explained what it is or
Yeah,
really what it does. Um, because that scene it's so quick and so full of action. He and Tommy build it together, and then actually it's Tommy that fixes it. It's Tommy that is the reason why the Wire gets defeated.
yeah, because like obviously they end up just whacking her on a cassette, which like to my
Yeah,
not
Betamax cassette,
yeah
which is especially funny considering they went defunct. Not because they were actually better quality than VHS, but apparently they were a lot more expensive, so that's
yeah
why they went out.
um and then they're just like it's fine, we'll just tape over her, which
Yeah.
is so which is such a like tragic end for like that character because like obviously the Wire in whatever form she was in before like obviously committed some serious crimes in order to have been sentenced to execution like
Yeah.
by her own race um and then to have an end just like it's fine we'll just take over her with like I don't know like you've been framed or something like to have such a like anticlimactic death for a character like that is kind of almost like her just desserts.
It's kind of reminiscent of the family of blood and how they get trapped in
Yeah,
various things for eternity. That kind of except that the Doctor isn't really framed as cruel for doing this,
yeah.
which
Like obviously he was
yeah,
like, like
he's
Time
just
Lord victorious. Like
yeah,
with the family of blood, he went like full like insane mode. But
yeah,
I think in this episode, kind of like with the influence of Rose, she's like kind of like well, she literally says like, "Oh, it's fine. I'll do it." Like
mm,
she's like suffered firsthand like at this entity, so she's like, "Don't worry, like I'll kill her," basically.
yeah,
But talking of Family of Blood, there was another like reference to an episode that I caught in this, which was when the Doctor first finds all the faceless in the room, um, and like they're all kind of slowly moving. It kind of reminded me of Rose,
mm,
like the episode Rose, when she's in the room with all the Autons at the start, and like they all start moving, and like obviously it's like kind of no actual faces because it's kind of just plastic. It kind of felt like a similar thing. Obviously not exactly the same, but it was very reminiscent of that.
yeah. I was thinking something similar because like every time they kind of moved their arms or their hands, there was this plastic kind of squeaking sound, and a part of me just doesn't understand why that was used in a way
Like,
because they are still flesh and blood.
yeah,
I mean,
I guess. Sorry, yeah,
I guess it's to show how different they are and how much has been taken away from them, but it's
Yeah.
a bit.
Like almost the lack of humanity and like
Yes, exactly. That's what I was trying to say.
kind of just muscles moving by themselves, not being told to do it.
Mm.
And like I guess to draw that comparison between them and like mannequins, like, but it's still it's a very peculiar choice for them to have made.
Yeah. One thing I really liked is when they got into the. This is going back a little bit now, but when the doctor and the detective and Tommy show up at Magpie's shop, um,
Mhm.
you've got the wire, and first of all, he picks up that device, he licks it, and then
Yeah,
talks about the Picolite plastic, which I liked that he licked it before he used the Sonic, because the amount of times in the Moffat and especially the Chibnall era where the Sonic is just used to
like
figure
it's
out
too
literally
much.
anything. It's quite nice that the doctor just kind of licks it to see what it is
A
instead.
good old fashioned way of investigating. Let me just lick the electric thing.
But then of course the detective comments, "Oh, but it looks like a television, but it's portable. But obviously, to us, that's normal nowadays
Yeah,
with like phones and laptops and
yeah,
tablets and stuff." But also, then she turns briefly into color as well on the TV. It's like color TV, and it's the irony of us watching this episode on color TV
yeah,
as he's saying this, because obviously back then that's revolutionary. I mean, the TV itself is revolutionary. I mean, we get Mr.
yeah,
Connolly commenting about about Muffin the Mule, about how it's almost in the room, kind of thing.
yeah. Which like to us is like ridiculous, like
Yeah.
because obviously our technology is like even more advanced than that, and it's like we're watching it and we're like, well, it's not though, is it? Like it's filmed in a studio somewhere, but like back then it was like this revolutionary technology, and like
Mm.
especially for the coronation, like made people feel like they were sat there watching it themselves.
Yeah, because
I mean,
that
like
is
well,
the
like
yeah that
like
is the
in
event that popularized it
yeah,
for mainstream audiences.
which is really interesting to think about, like what would have happened if like the coronation had been like maybe a little bit earlier before the technology was ready, like
Or someone made the decision to just put it on radio
yeah,
instead. Yeah.
because her father when he was crowned, I think his was the first broadcast over radio,
Yes. Yeah, it was.
and then obviously hers was the first over TV. And obviously the one we've just had was like on everything, like it was on every streaming platform.
It's on
Well,
pretty much
every
every
one.
channel.
Yeah,
But you could not watch anything unless you went on the
except
streaming
for
service or
I think
used a
like Channel
DVD.
5, which were
Yeah.
playing the Emoji Movie, which is
Oh, that was
outstanding.
funny. I mean, I didn't watch that. My mum wanted to watch the coronation because it's a day in history. But
Yeah, I mean I
yeah.
was working, so
Oh, fun. I
what a
was
shame.
working in the morning just before it started, but yeah, I
But
didn't get to miss all of it.
unlucky.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just really interesting. I think it's a very good event for them to have set a episode in, especially one like this about kind of technology, family, all that kind of
Yeah.
thing really fits in well. I think it's just an excellent episode.
Mm. I also find it interesting that the Doctor name drops Kylie in this episode because
Mm,
he quotes one of her lyrics and it's like, oh, who said, oh, probably Kylie, which is funny because obviously Kylie plays
yeah,
a one-off companion in a David Tennant episode.
she's Astrid, isn't she?
Yeah,
Astrid, yeah. Obviously doesn't end particularly well for her, but
no, well, it couldn't have done because
no,
they needed to write her out. Um, but apparently, because Russell didn't think they were going to get her, it was like a shocking thing.
when she
But
was like, "I'll do it."
yeah, but Voyage of the Damned is still the most viewed Doctor Who episode ever.
Mm.
Um, One thing I like about the climax, because obviously you've got the wires at this point is spread across all of London. And Mr. Magpie is hanging onto the tower and then gets disintegrated.
Yeah,
Um, but it's interesting because we actually get to see the effects on the general public. We see, Tommy's family get um the I can't think of a way of saying it without sounding vaguely rude. You know what I mean?
yeah, like sucked in.
Yeah, let's go with that. Sucked in. There we go.
Drawn
We'll
in.
go with that.
Like there's not really a way to say it. Like
No. Um. So, but it's nice that not nice, but it's good for us to be able to see the actual danger
yeah,
because it increases the stakes, it invests us in the story in a way. We get to see these characters, or at least some of these characters we've interacted with, and we're seeing it in live time. And it's something we start to lose outside of Russell's era. I mean, I know we did get a bit of it in Spyfall with Yaz's family, but
yeah,
a lot of episodes in the Moffat era and the Chibnall era, because I guess because the companions are less grounded, we get less information about their families
yeah,
often. That it doesn't, we don't see the effects on the regular people, but that's what makes things scary. That's what makes some of the Dalek episodes scary is we see people screaming in the streets.
yeah,
We see the people looting in shops. We see, the destruction, the chaos on regular people. That's what
yeah,
makes things impactful. And I like that we get to see that in this
yeah.
episode.
And it's like kind of the same in the episodes, like the two-part beforehand, because like
Mm,
you see people being taken in by the Cybermen, but also like once the connection's broken, you see everyone
yeah,
kind of scattering around, and there's kind of a panic, like the frantic running, and like everyone's climbing all over each other, like trying to get
yeah.
away. I
I
think,
mean, they're literally pushing the Cybermen out of the way, which I found
yeah,
quite funny. Uh,
outstanding. Yeah, I think it's something that this season in particular does really well is like kind of the theme of humanity is really heavy, like through Tennant's era entirely, but I think
yeah.
especially kind of the impact on the everyday people
Mm,
um, as well comes through a lot. Uh, and like I think like that is something to do with the context of the time and like obviously in the 2000s, like everything felt a bit smaller. Whereas nowadays
yeah.
everything is very open and connected, and I think it's kind of a lot more difficult to maybe make audiences not only connected to a character but also their entire family. But
Mm,
I think it's something the earlier seasons of Doctor Who did really well. Again, like with the character of Martha and then her family, like
yeah.
subsequently.
But
Um,
also like Rose and with Jackie and Mickey, Donna and her mum and granddad. And I mean,
Wilfred,
even in like Star on Earth Journey's End, the amount of characters that, even if they don't have family, they've got friends and they've
yeah,
got a life outside of what they are in the TARDIS. And I mean, we get a bit of that in Series 7 with Amy and Rory,
yeah.
and we get a bit with Clara and Danny, I guess, but even that was mostly surrounding the Doctor. And we
Yeah.
get Yaz's family.
But it's like you only see characters in like specifically in the Moffat era and Chibnall's, like you only see characters in regards to their relationship with the Doctor. You don't ever
Yeah.
see characters exist like on their own beforehand for long enough,
Mm,
like to see how interrupted their daily life is.
yeah. Yeah, so what would you rate this episode?
Um, I would give it a 7 out of 10 to be honest. I
Mm-hmm.
think I don't think anything in this season is below a 7 out of 10 to be honest. It's one of
Not
my
really
favorite
even
seasons.
even Love and Monsters, even Fear Her.
Okay. Do you know what? Fear used to scare me so much as a kid. I have to give it like props to how
Really?
uncomfortable it made me. I did not like the thing in the wardrobe. I did
Yeah,
not like
no, that's fair.
um Love and Monsters. I forgot that was in this season, but I don't. It doesn't count. But like, I kind of enjoy it from like a comedy
Yeah,
aspect.
so do I. I
I
enjoy it
make fun
a
of it.
lot. I really don't like Fear, but that's
But
anyway.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I gave it a 6 out of 10. Like, I enjoy it, and I think it's got some great themes and some great elements. I just think it's a bit. I don't know. I don't know what is really stopping me, but there's something that stops me from connecting with some of the characters in the way that I would normally would.
hmm.
I'm not
No,
entirely sure. I think it's more of a me problem than it is the episode's problem. But
I think it's like kind of the episode where if you don't like, not like lived experience, but like if you don't immediately look at the family and be like, yeah, like you kind of don't feel it. Like if you, not like if your family life isn't exactly like the ones there, because like that would not be ideal, but like
yeah,
if you kind of see the family and don't humanize them, if that makes sense.
why I do humanize it. I can empathize with the characters. I just there's
No,
something
yeah,
stopping me from really getting engaged in the episode, and I'm not sure why.
yeah,
No, I
it's
don't know. I
very.
do, I think it's a me problem. It's a very subjective opinion, but yeah.
I
So
feel
a
like
six
I'm
out of
just
10.
too generous with my ratings overall. I'm just like I watch it and I'm like, man, I forgot how good this was.
I mean, normally I'm the one who's too generous, but I don't know. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh on the season because I don't. I mean, it's my least favorite of Russell seasons, I think, but I do enjoy it. It's still like my sixth favorite season of Doctor Who, so out of 13, so it's still in the top half. But
Yeah, I think I just prefer the earlier few seasons just because they have a lot more nostalgia for me, which like obviously
yeah.
clouds my judgment immediately.
Mm. Although I started watching during the Matt Smith era, and yeah, I've got more nostalgia for the Russell T Davies era. I don't know where that is, but it's a thing. Yeah, so that's it for this episode. And hopefully join me next time when I review. I think it's The Impossible Planet Satan Pit is the next one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
nice.
Hey, see you next time.